Welcome to the Trauma-Informed Lens podcast. I'm your host, Matt Bennett. Each episode we talk about the research and practical aspects of the trauma-informed movement. This podcast is not designed to replace mental health services. If you feel uncomfortable or triggered by our discussion, please consider seeking your own trauma treatment. In no way is seeking treatment an admission of weakness. It is a chance to build resiliency and experience post-traumatic growth. You can find show notes, resources, and more at traumainformedlens.org. Welcome, friends, to the Trauma-Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I've got a very special guest from Canadian. And so I think our first friend from up north, Alan Kanerva, who is going to talk to us. I'm really excited about this conversation. I've heard of this term. I've read a little bit about it, but I was also nerding out a little bit before we got on Neuro Linguistic programming and doing it from a trauma-focused perspective. So, Alan, I'm really excited to bring your expertise to our listeners. Talk a little bit about your work with post-traumatic growth, recovery. Your background sounds fascinating. So before I get all nerdy with you, give our listeners an introduction to who you are and a little bit about your work.
Super. Thanks so much, Matthew, first and foremost, for inviting us on the show. It's so important that we collaboratively we come together to overcome trauma. And I don't care what school you're in or what modality you use, the cause is too big for us to create silos and to defend our silo. I think we need to be open to the conversation. I tell everybody that I meet, and I'll get into the numbers, the science in a minute, but if somebody puts an intervention into trauma that's faster than what we do, higher efficacy with less re-traumatization, I'll switch gears in a nanosecond.
Amen.
Just put it in front of me. But that hasn't happened yet, Matt, so here we go.
Your statistics are very impressive, so yes.
They're building, brother. They're building.
Yeah.
So, I just, as you and I were talking earlier, I just celebrated my 65th birthday. 23,725 days on the planet. Lovely. And, when you live like that, I grew up in a small mining town. And I left the mining town, I joined the military, and I was a military helicopter pilot flying tactical aviation in support of the Army. I also did a lot of search and rescue work. So in that work, I saw some things. In my military career, Matt, I was at a airport in northern Alberta called Namao, a base. And it was one of the former Strategic Air Command bases, so a massive base. Yeah. And I was watching Hercules aircraft do what are called low altitude parachute extraction runs, where they go down the runway low level, throw a parachute out the back, it pulls a pallet out with a load, it goes down the runway. We've seen that dramatized on Fast and Furious and other movies where they launch cars out the back, right? Unfortunately, this was a training mission, so they had multiple crews on board, and they went down the runway and the load got stuck at the back of the airplane. And that moved the center of the gravity back to the aircraft. Now I'm sitting in the helicopter on the tarmac with my rotor turning, ready to go on a mission, watching this, and I watched the Herc go vertical, straight up until it stalled, and I watched it come right back down into the smoldering hole. Fellow aircrew, it's a base, so aircrew, no aircrew, and personal friends were on that airplane. So I had events like that, and I never knew that bothered me until I was telling this story at a training last May, and I broke down. A Canadian military helicopter sitting over my shoulder right here in multinational colors. And so we accumulate stuff like that in our life. And sometimes by virtue of our genetics or our nurturing, our nature, whatever it is, some of us just process information, we compartmentalize, we make sense, and we keep going. Others of us, when we see something horrific, it's debilitating. Mm-hmm. We instantly tank. And my experience is that about 20% of the people over here that just make sense of it and keep moving, and about 20% over here that are impacted desperately right away. And then the 60% in the middle are a continuum. Mm-hmm. And at any time, anybody on that continuum can get sucked into the vortex of post-traumatic stress. So so that was that. And then I spent about 15 years in business. I left the military and I got into business. And during that period, my first wife and I lost our first child. And so, there's another event that came up. Now, fortunately, I'd already studied NLP. And we chose to do a technique, an NLP technique with the loss of our son called reframing. You know, premise is that nothing has any meaning except the meaning you give it. So we chose to celebrate his life as perfect, just short. And I celebrate, I tell that story. Now, and I also talk about appropriate and warranted emotions. When you're traumatized and you have full sympathetic, abnormal, and abreaction, that's, to me, that's inappropriate and unwarranted, especially if it's a decade or 2 decades after you're traumatized. So when I talk about my son, the loss of my son, I'm sad that I don't have a 27-year-old son. Make no bones about it. I have 5 children. I'd love to, if the 6th was still alive. But it doesn't debilitate me. I don't have nightmares. I don't have intrusive thoughts. I don't resent anybody. I don't feel shame or guilt or any of those hallmark things. To me, it's an appropriate and warranted. And I think using the NLP techniques then certainly saved me. And my ex-wife could speak for herself. But, you know, we shortly, I guess it was 16 months later, we had our next son, right? So we were able to overcome. And that would be, for most people, a very traumatizing event to lose your first child.
Absolutely.
So after I was in business and I was sitting on the boards of nonprofits in my late 40s and mid 40s, late 40s. And I thought I'd be a hellishly good executive director of a nonprofit, you know, ego monster. And so I left the business community, Matt. I went back to school, did a master's degree in a field called human security and peace building. And that started a journey into humans, into post-humanitarian crisis and post-conflict scenarios. So I was in Iraq in 2004, I was in Uganda in 2005, and I was in Kenya during the post-election violence, 2008 to 2010. And I saw the very worst and the very best of what humanity can do during those periods. And I saw a lot of people get traumatized and have, you know, at least in the military, when you come home, you're supposed to have a support net. When you're working as an NGO person, you're over there and you come home and you've volunteered to work with your local church or you pick an organization, care. When you come home, there is that contract's over, you're on your own. You're in a vacuum. And so, you know, having studied NLP in 1990 and that was kind of this, you know, in 1992, losing my son, but using NLP to overcome that trauma. And when I studied NLP in 1990 for the first time, I had debilitating headaches, migraine headaches. Now, as a child, my family would find me, you know, literally passed out and drag me home, and I'd vomit and go to sleep for 24 hours. I had headaches that ruined family vacations. I had these severe. 1990, on course, in an NLP course, we did a technique, and I've had one migraine headache since that I remember. I don't get migraines anymore. I've had other headaches that I earned. You and I were talking about beer consumption earlier. So I've had other headaches that I've earned, but no migraines. And anybody who's had migraines knows the difference.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I've been in the NLP community for 30 years. And when I came home from the Middle East in 1990, I knew something wasn't right, Matt. If you talk to my ex-wife, she knew something wasn't right. Hyper-vigilant. I've always been a very vigilant person, but now we're in the hyper aware, always asking why. Why is this here? Why is that there? Why is this? Why is that? Right? Flash to bang trigger so fast. And, you know, it probably contributed greatly to the end of our marriage because, you know, how do you live with that? Right? In fairness, how do you live with that? And hypnagogic dreams, like I'd wake up and be in full flight. I'm not talking about a nightmare. I'm talking about where I have to take action. And again, my first wife could attest. The one night I woke up, bolted. It was danger so intense that I had to leave. I grabbed her by the arm and I ran. You know, she hit the floor 6 feet away from the bed. We turned the first corner in the hall. I'm not a truck driver. I don't know if I gave it enough room, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And so she had a bad ride that night. Another time we were camping and we had a motorhome with a sleeping berth above the cab, and I was up there because one of our children were sick and they were back in the you know, the suite in the back. And I had that dream that I had to get out, and I left that bunk 5 feet in the air, hit the floor, hit the stove with my forearm, you know, woke up just in a panic.
Yeah.
Right? So I've been there, and I really, when I first started learning NLP, I wanted to use NLP to help people overcome trauma. It was already on the table in 1990. I just didn't
Yeah,
have
that was one of my questions, because 90 is really fairly early in the trauma movement. So you were getting some of that through your educational learning experience even back then.
We were starting to call it trauma in the military, when, but back up to the mid 90s, some special forces units in Canada were still parading anybody who got what they called combat fatigue as being weak.
Yeah.
Right. So you didn't put up your hand and say much. And just, I don't think I had the personal fortitude or courage to stand up and say, I can help people with trauma. I just didn't have it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Fast forward the clock. My wife starts studying NLP because she's a birth doula, and she wants to help women overcome birth traumas and help women have calm, natural delivery. And she took a course in Nevada. On the second day of course, she phoned home. She said, okay, you've got to give up what you're doing and just put up your shingle. You're an NLP coach because I've been listening to you for 10 years. That's all you do anyways. So quit trying to hide behind anything. You're now an NLP coach.
We finally have a label for you.
Yeah, thank you. And we did it. We did it. We drove our stake in the sand, and a lot of people do NLP coaching and they sort of sneak up on it. Even Tony Robbins, right? And neuro associative conditioning. It's just pure NLP with his gifts in it, and he is gifted. And so we stood up, we planted our flag, and we're a NLP coaching and training facility here in Canada. And so my wife's focus is helping women through all the transitions that women face in lives. I joke that men only have one transition, pre and post puberty, and then we're good. But women seem to have a more, single, married, kids, no kids, divorces, careers. And they all have a lot of emotional ride, and some of it very traumatizing. I focus purely on trauma. And in that work, I immersed myself in the leading thinking on trauma, all modalities, and everything kept coming back to me. So I studied Phil Zimbardo's work on time perspective inventory from Stanford University, and I've embedded that in our protocols here. And I note that you're looking at heart rate variability work, and I've just sort of cottoned on to that his survey may actually be an indication of where the incoherence between mind and heart are in past positive or past negative or fatalistic thought. And I'm just sort of coalescing those thoughts and getting them together. But in this research, I came up against a group out of New York State. They originally called the NLP, Research and Recognition Organization, and they dropped the term NLP and became the Research and Recognition Organization, founded and headed by Dr. Frank Bork. Mm-hmm. Now, he is a former Cornell prof who in his early 60s or late 60s, mid 60s, was asked by the Aon Corporation to help their people who had been caught at 9/11 in New York. So he treated 250 people personally who had been 100 stories and higher for trauma using the NLP model. And then he dedicated his life's work to research. Now they did a pilot study and 3 follow-on studies. His partner, Dr. Richard Gray, is probably the leading thinker on why NLP works. Mm-hmm. Not how it works, but why it works when it's working. They've also done neuroimaging studies. And in their research, they had over a 92% success rate with no recurrence up to a year out. Yeah. I got really close to the organization. I gave them about 1,600 hours of volunteer time in 18 months. I became their director of training. I wrote their curriculum. I wrote their trainer's manual, their participant manual. I did their first 9 beta trainings for them, got the machine running right. We trained over 150 licensed healthcare professionals from Albuquerque, New Mexico to Orlando, Florida, Toronto. And all of them went out and got the same results or better than the research group got in research. Now that just doesn't happen, Matt. Yeah. Normally when you start training, there's a degradation in results. Yeah. The farther from the source you get. And we didn't have that. Amazing. Because the protocol is so succinct and clear that and deliverable. Now the protocol, the actual NLP protocol, when we talk about trauma-focused NLP, a term that we coined and we use, that's a continuum of care based on NLP. Okay. It has an assessment. It has 5 pieces in it. And in the 3rd piece, you do the trauma intervention. but we go after adverse childhood events like crazy. Now, I know that you are really well grounded in adverse childhood events. Everybody I know that's been traumatized as an adult has an adverse childhood event.
Yeah, absolutely.
If that's your experience. So our protocol, the Trauma-Focused NLP, also uses a lot of timeline therapy by Dr. Tad James. Timeline therapy is, having been in NLP for 30 years, and he got the first NLP Lifetime Recognition Award given out by the NLP International Federation in Europe. It is the most sophisticated, focused use of NLP and Erickson hypnosis that you can use. You know, I teach it, I use it, it's our go-to stuff. It is beautiful at dumping baggage we carry, emotional baggage, limiting beliefs, those sort of things. So we do, so we clear past negative emotions, we clear significant emotional events like adverse childhood events, we clear the traumas, but we also work with the belief structure that comes out of a traumatizing event.
Talk about that a little bit. I think that's fascinating. So when you say belief structure, I think I know what you're talking about, but what does that mean sort of in your approach?
Well, pick as an example, as a very specific example, a person is accosted in a park at dusk by a man with a long blonde ponytail and a baseball cap. So the trauma, you clear the trauma of the actual physical interaction, but the person made some decisions about their world, Matt. You and I cannot believe anything unless we've decided to believe it. There's always a decision point. So in that traumatic event, some decisions were made about the world. Parks are unsafe. Men with ponytails are unsafe. Men with baseball caps are unsafe. And so now you and I as trauma clinicians, we clear the trauma, but this person still has a cluster, a constellation of decisions they've made about their world. And so we clear the trauma, they're not having nightmares or intrusive thoughts, but they're walking down the street 2 weeks later and they see a man with a baseball cap coming at us and they cross the street to get out of the way. That's a very simple example of a decision and a belief. Car accidents, sexual traumas, military, trust issues, worthiness issues. I'm not worthy, like world can't be trusted. Those are decision and belief structures that can come from a traumatic event. So when we talk about moving forward, so imagine we've done all this getting rid of the negativity. Viktor Frankl would say that you could end up in an existential vacuum.
Yeah.
The narrative that we tell each other about who we are is informed by the past.
Yeah.
And so here we are at this point where now our story doesn't hold water anymore. We can't even tell the story the same way.
Right.
And so we work then to reconnect to the positive of people's lives. You and I have all had, all of us, all the listeners have been jumped in a lake or had an ice cream cone or a sour candy and smiled and laughed our heads off, right? We've all laughed.
Yeah.
David Kessler talks about unraveling the mysteries of mental illness in his book Capture. And he talks about the neurological link from a salient stimulus to a negative emotional state that when gets fired, right? The saying in psychology, what gets fired gets wired.
Yeah.
So you're wiring. You do it so much that the neurological links, the pathways to positive emotional states start to atrophy. And people say things, you've heard this yourself with clients. I just can't remember being happy. I can't imagine what being happy would be like. Past and future links to happiness are gone.
Yeah.
So we spend a lot of time with clients reconnecting, again, using a variant of timeline therapy and using some techniques from Connie Ray Andreas in Boulder, Colorado, around wholeness and core transformations to reconnect people to positivity.
Yeah.
And now with their new narrative, we help them set their course and take it into the future using the learnings we know about habits, how new habits are formed.
Great.
So it's not just, I can clear a trauma. Any NLP practitioner worth their salt can clear a trauma in 20 or 30 minutes. But that's just the tip.
Let's accept. Can you explore that term a little bit more? Because I think it's not something you might hear in a lot of the trauma literature is clearing a trauma. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about, because that's a pretty, that's a big statement to say give me 30 minutes, I'll clear a trauma. So explain that a little bit more. Because I could see my listeners going, wait a minute, what's he talking about? This Canadian.
Especially anybody who has suffered for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years.
Absolutely.
And they've gone through 22, 28, 30 sessions, 2 years of some form of talk therapy. They've been medicated. And I had the pleasure, the privilege, and when I was working for Research and Recognition, when I ran those first 9 trainings, I did 3 live demos at every training.
Wow.
Where somebody with full-blown diagnosed trauma, unresolved, would come to the front of the room. And I use the word clear because what we're doing, I'll get into the science of what happens to the memory in a second. Clearing is the best word I can use because the person is no longer triggered. When they think about that thing that used to traumatize them, they're no longer dragged into hyper-emotional, negative emotional states. They're no longer, their sympathetic nervous system does not flash up. They can just tell the story clearly, concisely, fluidly, without any sympathetic arousal now. And the only word I can use is that we've cleared the trauma. It's the best term. I will never use the word cure. We overcome the symptoms by doing that, but when I tell you how it works, the term will make sense.
Okay.
All right. And so, I've done probably with Research and Recognition, 27 live demos. I've probably done another 40 or 50 in other presentations in other places. Right. And so here's how it works. The old thinking about memories was that once a memory was stored, its content and structure was stored in a specific place. And every time you activated that memory or retrieved it, once you put it back to put it away, it went to the same place, same structure. The new thinking on memories, new, decade old. And the research is one of the front runners in this research is at McGill University, Karim Nader, on the reconsolidation of memories. So we have a memory, we reactivate it, and it goes into a period of labilization where it's moderately unstable and malleable. It can be changed, and it can be changed for the positive or the negative. Now, a lot of people who are traumatized, that memory gets negatized. Now, it goes back into memory, it goes to a new location, new construct, more negative than when it came out. Have it again in another negative construct, and you start the spiral down and in, to the point where you're at death's door, right? So the memory can get worse and worse and worse. Conversely, when it's in that period of malleability, if you do something to improve it, when it goes back into long-term storage, it goes in a positive way. And I believe, this is my belief, I don't have any way to research it yet, but I believe every therapy, when it works, whether you're doing EMDR, CBT, even prolonged exposure, when it works, we're actually all doing the same thing. It's in that period of malleability. We've impacted the memory sufficiently in a positive way that when it goes back into long-term storage, it no longer lights up the amygdala. It's referenced through the hippocampus or somewhere else, right? And that fundamental thing, I think, when we get down to it, it's like you probably heard of the experiments that they did with MDMA. And people have had a lot of overcoming trauma through meditation. So imagine activating a memory, being in a period of labilization lasting 6 or more hours where you meditate positively and you move yourself out of beta into higher frequencies. That memory may get impacted sufficiently. I have no research for it, but when it goes back into long-term storage, it's impacted. And there is a lot of good research about meditation helping overcome trauma.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the pets, I think the equine programs, the canine programs, when they work, not as a coping strategy, but as the person's no longer triggered, which is very rare, but they do the same thing. Right? So how can I say clear a trauma? So is it okay to mention another podcast on your podcast, Matt?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So for the listeners, there's a podcast out of Florida that I helped start with a guy named Jeff McLaughlin. It's called Life After PTSD. It's a brilliant podcast. Jeff's a great podcaster. In the early going, we had a guy named Kyle Lundy join the program. And he was a live demo subject. Now, this guy, severely traumatized, hadn't slept for 6 or so years. Go to bed for 4 or 5 or 6 hours, wake up 6 to 8 times. He had an emotional support dog the morning I met him named Star, beautiful black lab. And he was on the highest dosage of Zoloft in the world. 350 milligrams, 150 milligrams above the therapeutic limit of 200.
Wow.
Comes to the front of the room, we clear the trauma. So at the beginning, so to activate the memory, we get the person to start telling the story of that event which traumatized them. As soon as we see the sympathetic arousal, we break their state, get them calm. So that's the end of it. That's as trauma, because the memory's now reactivated. It's in the period of labilization. He's at the start. He's soaking wet with perspiration, Matt. He's fidgeting. His dog, the emotion Star, reflects his emotional state, and she is animated. She can't sit still. She's jumping up, licking his face. So we do the intervention, and the intervention has a lot of subtleties in it. The NLP intervention has so many layers of subtleties that, when I parse it all out, the first one is we get them to pick a safe place from before the trauma happened and a safe place after the trauma happened, relatively safe place. For anybody who's listening, who's been traumatized, you know that your trauma never ends. Yeah. It goes around. So that very act of picking a start and an ending, it's the first time they've ever had control of the narrative. It's subtle, but it's powerful. And then we go in and we change the submodalities of the movie. Yeah. And when a person changes the submodality, so our modalities are visual, auditory, kinesthetic, smells, olfactory, and gustatory, taste. When we change, the submodalities are the smaller components of that. So when we talk visual, it could be black and white or color or grays. Is it bright or dim? Is it near or far? What's the size of the image? Is it a movie or still? Those are the submodalities. So when we alter the submodalities and create some dissociation from the events, the person experiences it physiologically. Cool. So we do the intervention. Takes about 20 minutes. The way we do trauma-focused NLP, it's really gentle and pretty quick. So at the beginning, when that person first experiences, accesses their trauma, we ask them, as you just re-experience that trauma on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being no negative emotions, 10 being a flood of fear, terror, and helplessness, where were you? They'll always be at 7, 8, 9, or 10. So we do the intervention, we come back, and then we ask them, okay, if you want to, tell us about your trauma or replay the movie. Now, if a person has sexual trauma, I don't want them to tell the story to the public unless they're really comfortable. So many people do, though, at this point, because it's just a story. Yeah. And they tell the story. So a guy like Kyle starts talking, and he goes for 6 minutes, Matt. Talking. No arousal. Yeah. Clearly, lucidly, in detail that he didn't have 40 minutes before. And I said to Kyle, Kyle, I don't have to ask you how you're doing. And he says, why not? And I said, look at your dog. Star is rolled up in a ball with her tail over her nose and her 2 paws up under her stomach. That's awesome. Kyle goes home that night. Now, he was at the back of the room and coming forward as a volunteer, but he stayed for the whole training so he could witness it. He goes to bed home that night, and I begged him, take your meds, sleep, come home. I come back. And I said, you're going to sleep like a baby tonight. Rascal goes home. I don't think he took all his meds. Yeah, I'd have to get it confirmed, but I don't think he did. He went to bed at 10, set his alarm for 6, and he slept through the night. Wow. Straight through the night. Since then, so he comes back the next morning, and he audits the rest of the course. I did one other session with him at another training live on a separate trauma. Now, this is a guy who was deployed almost over 40 months, Afghanistan and Iraq, and he's a Marine. So when you're a Marine deployed in those locations, you've been outside the fence a couple times a week. You have had things done to you which are morally injurious, and you've done things to others that may be morally injurious. So this is an episodal PTSD. This is more like CPTSD, right? And we cleared the big 2 events for him. He got himself weaned off the drugs. I watched him vicariously on Facebook. And, I saw him one day, he was naked from the waist up saying he'd lost 20 pounds. Now, that's pretty courageous for a guy who's a recluse, suicidal, on that much Zola. A little while after that, I saw him all dressed up going out to a formal event with his dog. Beautiful. And then I saw him singing and playing his guitar on Facebook. This isn't the normal behavior of somebody who's that heavily traumatized. And then things kind of, I quit stalking him on Facebook for a while, but then late summer, early fall, I started seeing him posting. I've had the best week ever. I've just had another amazing week. I have never had this many good weeks. And by October, there's a picture of him and this beautiful young woman. He'd met a partner.
Wow.
And late October, he got his driver's license back. They got an apartment together. So this is from February to October, 6 months. Yeah. And then this February, I see a picture on Facebook, 2 hands and a wedding band.
That's awesome.
So this is a guy who had, and it's an anecdotal story, right? It's one episode. Yeah. But if you go on Life After PTSD, there's 60, 70 stories of people. World War II veteran carrying trauma for 70 years. Birth traumas, car accident traumas, military traumas, police traumas, you name it, they're there.
So I'd love to ask you a couple questions, because you mentioned this, and it may flow in right good to where we're at in the conversation is, with the more, because I know a lot of our listeners work with individuals experiencing homelessness, basically complex trauma across, not all of them, but I know a lot of my listeners do. So when you look at this, because I know EMDR, even though it does work on this, but it's very different from going from an acute trauma. Let's say you have a severe car wreck at age 35, but not really much adverse childhood experiences, where EMDR will help, process, integrate, clear, depending on the language.
Yes.
But it's a lot more challenging for those folks when you look at someone who may have been, and we know with epigenetics, you may have been born with epigenetic expression of trauma from your ancestors. So a lot of folks that end up in homelessness, end up in our prison systems have never really had that safe place. Now they may be able to think back cognitively to some place where they felt safe. So I don't want to, I like that thinking that you have, but if somebody comes looking for, hey, it's not just like one thing happened, but boy, I can't really remember a point in my life where I didn't struggle with trauma. Where would your starting point be with someone from that complex background?
Yeah, that's a great question, Matt. And we've had here in our own practice, we've had several clients who, God sends us the challenges we can handle, right? And I really believe that. And so one of my first trauma clients was somebody who had been sexually abused by 3 consecutive stepfathers from a young child to a late teen. Mm-hmm. I think that fits the bill for complex post-traumatic stress. And so as a position, I accept that there's at least 4 minds in the room when I'm working with the client: our conscious minds and our unconscious minds. So 2 conscious minds, 2 unconscious minds. And all behavior and all learning are in the realm of the unconscious mind, or subconscious. We call it unconscious. All learning and all behavior are in the realm of the unconscious mind. Certainly Dispenza and Lipton talk about that, and how those beliefs and behaviors sort of expose the genetic code, if you will. And so I like the client who had 15 years of trauma, I asked him to ask his unconscious mind. Now, understand that we're in deep rapport by now.
Yeah.
When I finally get to clearing trauma, I'm at hour 4 to 5 with them. I've done the 2-hour intake. I've cleared a bunch of stuff. We have deep rapport. Okay. We get in deep, and I just ask him, and they already know that we've been accessing their unconscious mind. They've learned to trust the answers that come up quickly, not process them, not cognitively get in there and mess them up. Take the genuine response from inside, and ask their unconscious mind, what is the most important trauma you could clear today in this session that would give you the most emotional benefit and release? Because we have a technique called the timeline scan, where we pick up all the significant emotional events and traumas in a lineage from as far back as they want to go. And we just, we present them with this, and it's very dissociated way of doing it. And we present them with this list and ask their unconscious mind, of all of these events, what would be the one event which, if we cleared today, which when cleared today, would give you the most emotional relief and benefit. And they always answer, Matt.
Yeah.
And then I ask for number 2 and number 3, and I clear those first 3. And then we just start checking with the others. Now, 1 of 2 things happen, Matt. As you check them, their unconscious mind go, no, I'm good. No, I'm good. No, I'm good. Right? And if you study Lisa Feldman Barrett, she says our emotions are actually a prediction of how we'll react when we encounter a stimulus. Now their brain's predicting, no, I'm good. When I have that memory again, I'm good. Right? And then on the next appointment, I'll represent the list and I'll go into those events. I'll have them tell me the story of those events or play it. And I'll ask them to do a subjective unit of distress, and I'll calibrate them using sensory acuity. And they'll be all good. Or if there's a period, Matt, I've actually cleared a period of trauma by asking the client again, would it be okay with your unconscious mind to clear all the traumatizing events between this point and this point as one procedure? Yes or no? Binary question.
Yeah.
I just want the unconscious mind answer. And if they've said yes, we clear it as a period. If they say no, then we do them as episodes.
Gotcha.
And it takes a little longer, but at the speed we're, at the tempo, and it's not about speed. I have to be so careful. It's about the tempo.
Yeah.
And the fundamental position I take when I'm working with a client is they've suffered long enough.
Yeah.
And I have a tool in my hand that in research and anecdotally, and it's courageous as hell for a person to come to the front of the room, put their trauma on the table, and courageous as hell to say, no, I'm no longer traumatized.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's I think, and it may be worth just a little bit more clarity, because, I think initially in my head, I had kind of, we were talking maybe Tony Robbins, sort of, hey,
yeah.
Who wants to come up to the room and clear all their trauma out? But it sounds like actually, for the most part, outside maybe those training scenarios, it is more like a traditional kind of therapeutic relationship where you do spend, it's not just, hey, I meet you, let's start clearing right away. You are building the psychological safety.
Even the demo people commit to doing some follow-on work, because again, if you've been traumatized, yeah, and that's a good point, Matt, is even the people who do demos commit to doing some follow-on work, because we've already talked about ending up in that existential vacuum.
Yeah.
When you're severely traumatized, your story is of a person who has post-traumatic stress. And to the best of my ability, I'm trying to drop the D out of the conversation. I don't like the stigma of it, but
right.
So you have post-traumatic stress. And in terms of brevity, though, the work we do in Trauma-Focused NLP is 10 hours plus 2 1-hour check-ins, one at 4 weeks after we've complete and one at another 4 weeks after. And that's where we do the exit interviews.
Okay.
So in our practice at tf-NLP, we're evidence-based. We use what's called a PSSI-5. It was a trauma assessment developed by Edna Foa at the VA. Mm-hmm. We use that pre and post treatment.
Great.
We also use Phil Zimbardo's ZTPI, ZTPI.
Love our acronyms.
Yeah, well, it's Zimbardo's time perspective inventory, and it's a graphic. So when we do that assessment with the client on day 1, you can see that their past negatives are massively high and their past positives are massively low. They just don't have access to past positives. Right. And their fatalism, they've either had to decide they have to control everything, they've become control freaks, or they feel their life is out of control. Mm-hmm. Their hedonism is low, and their future may be low, or they may be compensating sort of in a strategy about tomorrow's going to be better. Yeah. But the graph is a smile. And afterwards, when we complete it, we show them the new graph where their past positive is low, their past negative is low, past positive is high. Fatalism is in a great spot. Hedonism is a great spot, and future is good. Now, Stanford University and Zimbardo brilliantly surveyed tens of thousands of people in 29 countries. Mm-hmm. And they provide a baseline for what an average person who takes life's ups and downs and strides look like. So we now can compare the person to this baseline pre and post, and it's cross-cultural, 29 different countries. So we do those tests pre and post, but in the scheme of things, the 10 hours that we do in 2.5 weeks, Matt. Mm-hmm. Monday, Thursday, done, 2.5 weeks. A person, if they're off work, can be back in work 2.5 weeks.
Wow. And
So that's
you're getting that 92%, those big jumps just in that short period of time.
the 92% in the research. This is even more fascinating. In the research, they didn't do a complete protocol of tf-NLP. They just did the singular technique.
Okay.
And they tested pre-technique and post-technique using PSSI-5.
Wow.
And they were doing the clearing in 3 to 5 sessions, 90-minute sessions.
Wow. That's amazing. So the other thing that, and I think there's a lot of acknowledgement of this now. So I wonder how folks practicing this exciting skill set and technique and approach, one of the things I've come to really appreciate, and to just get, it seems like we share the nerdy side of the fascination with the human experience. So a lot of times, especially with very early childhood trauma, and also potentially in adults, that the trauma memories are tricky things. As I joke, because I talk about how, EMDR and other, about the destabilization of the memory surrounding it by different emotional states before it locks back in. So we share that single language. One of the things I've really come, and looking back at my work with children, but also with, the extreme populations like homelessness and others coming from the complex traumas, we know during the traumatic event, the adrenaline, cortisol can disrupt normal functioning of the hippocampus and other memory centers of the brains. A lot of work done from how memories are stored with the body. In childhood, we know underdevelopment of the Broca's area or expressive language. So with this emerging understanding we have that traumatic memories aren't always well put into coherent words and thoughts. I wonder, have your folks done any thinking about, not everybody's able to put their trauma into words, and how do you work with folks that might struggle from that language perspective to communicate and put it into a kind of coherent story, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, the couple of really key points here, because that's a great question again, because when I was teaching for the research and recognition, I'd have very tenured psychologists and up to psychiatrists in the room. Mm-hmm. And some of them say, look, this won't work. My client has no memory of the event. And so in the NLP perspective, one of our presuppositions of NLP is that your unconscious mind stores all memories. It organizes them temporally and atemporally, but it represses memories with unresolved negative emotions to save you, to protect you, and it will represent those memories when there's a time or when they're healed.
Interesting. So from your perspective, that, because repressed memories have been such a fascinating thing through my like they were controversial when I was in grad school, and they continue to be. But from your perspective, you do see those as just they're just not accessible to the conscious level.
In my experience, anecdotally, but also in the research that research and recognition did, is that the if they could identify a start point and an end point surrounding the trauma and do the intervention is a movie setting, a movie theater that you run the movie in black and white, rewind it in color. That if you can get a start and end point and do it, me, the clinician, I never need to know the content. And in fact, when I ask the person to tell me about the trauma at the beginning, it's just to reactivate the memory. Okay. I don't listen to everybody's story about the drama they went through. Yeah. To me, as a clinician, it keeps me whole, keeps me safe. And this is a funny aside. I'll come back to the point, but as a clinician, I can see 5 or 6 people in a day without feeling exhausted because I don't hear their whole story. And I know, because of the 92% success rate, when they sit in the chair, an hour later, we're going to be in a way better place, and it sticks. So you bring me the 3rd client, the 4th client of the day, I'm jacking up. Yeah. I'm getting hyper. Bring me the next one. As opposed to, I talk to other people who do other forms of therapy. And, I know a SISM guy down in Florida who, once he learned this protocol, he was angry. And I said, what's wrong? He said, well, I've gone to work so many days and worked with so many traumatized people and sent them home and then spent the night worrying about them. Yeah. The weight of a career doing that, Matt. And the guy needs a medal, and he also needs to clear his own traumas.
Yeah, exactly.
So this lack of language, I cleared a trauma with a young Israeli woman living in America, but Israeli. She'd been part of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, and had something happen in Israel. Let your mind go crazy at that point. I got her to activate the memory, got her calm, did the intervention, had her run the movie of that memory at the end. I didn't get her to describe it. She was perfectly calm. And I know her personally, and I've checked in with her a number of times. No, this doesn't bother her anymore. And she looked at me and she said, oh, that's what it means to be content free.
Yeah.
That's what it means. So she never had to put the experience into language.
Okay.
So that's one example. Here's another example, though. A Marine pilot who had a severe trauma in northern Iraq in 1990. And he was another demo at a training. He couldn't even start to think about that thing that traumatized him. And it's on one of the podcasts, I believe. And his memory ended at the point of the traumatization. He didn't. There's no memories after that. He couldn't. He would break down. So we cleared the trauma, and at the end of it, he started telling a story. He told a story that led to the thing that traumatized him, and it was significant. There was a small child involved, and at that point, after we cleared the trauma, he realized he got to tell the story that the child was perfectly healthy and safe. He never had. He couldn't tell that. He couldn't get to that point previously. And then he told a story. So what they had done is they, in the first Iraqi conflict, there was 10,000 Kurds who were being pushed from the south by the Iraqi forces and contained by the Turkish forces in a valley in the mountains and were going to starve to death. And as a Marine pilot, he'd gone in, and at the first pass, they had this incident. But after that, they delivered humanitarian aid, and he was a key figure in it for almost 6 months. They brought in Medicine Sans Frontier. They brought in food. They brought in water, and they kept these 10,000 people safe. And it was a story that's worthy of a book, because the people would swarm their helicopter every time they land. So they would have to play bait and switch with multiple helicopters, pretend they're landing here and land over there with a different helicopter. He told that whole story without a single sympathetic arousal. All the details were there, Matt. And I've had that same thing happen with women who are going through nasty divorces, where in the battle, their husbands are claiming they're not fit to be a mother, and they're getting them in court and poking them.
Yeah. And
they're having sympathetic arousal coming unglued in court and demonstrating they're not fit to be mothers. Clear the trauma, and they go in. Now they go in, they tell the story of the trauma, of the events with their ex in detail, lucidly, clearly, calmly. And they can't be provoked. They can't be re-traumatized in court. And the outcomes are different for them. Significantly different.
Fascinating. So one of the things, I mean, and this is just, as my listeners know, I go into my personal curiosity the later we go on. So, they're used to this, but I'll apologize to you as a guest. Like, one of the things that I'm interested.
Well, the problem with you and me is we're gonna end up in a craft beer place down either in Canada or in Denver, and like they'll be going, hey, we and we'll just say, well, lock up and come back tomorrow.
Yeah, we'll have to stick some microphone somewhere, at least in the early part of that conversation. I told you about our double IPA, so you have to be a little careful about when you're recording. But
10% beer, even for a Canadian, is dangerous.
Hey, I'm glad we could impress our friends up to the north. One of the things that I've been, especially with my kind of deep dive right now into the polyvagal theory, heart rate variability, I find all that stuff, as somebody who's trained as a cognitive behavioral therapist, I find the wisdom of the body. And I think we start to go into, gut health, but, we can name everything a brain if we want to. I don't know if that does us any good or not. But I'm fascinated about the bottom-up processing. I think there's a lot there that we've missed in psychology. One of the pieces of nerdy insight that I have is we talk about, in certain approaches to healing in psychology, states and traits, and how someone living, and we can bring in epigenetics if we want to in this, if we see people living in high stress situations, whether it's a war zone, whether it's a violent family. I've worked with a lot of gang members coming out of really violent, basically war zones in our inner cities. that fight or flight, which for you or I, if somebody cuts us off on the interstate, it's great to get out of the way, right? I always say you want your flight and fight response to be a healthy fight or flight response is right there, right? So it's not like we're doing that. But a lot of the kids I worked with and then adults into homelessness, that hyper aroused or even hypo aroused with the freeze response state becomes a trait that they use to survive. And it seems like the research is showing where we used to have this great thing of 21 days creates a habit that, sometimes I wish I just stopped my learning when it was good. Now it's like 66 days to see that biological change. So I wonder with folks that you're working with that seem highly in a fight or flight sympathetic state, like this is kind of who they've become. How do you kind of explain, I'd just be fascinated with any insights you might have. Like you're getting very good results in a time frame that seems to push that point where we can see a biological changes of a behavior or a way of thinking. I just kind of wonder if you have any thoughts about why this is changing, states from what it seems like, or changing traits in a very quick way. Is there any insight you see in the research you've all done?
The unfortunate piece, Matt, and I guess the both the crisis and the opportunity, if you will, in the moment, in what we're doing in trauma, is that we've only now understood what we're doing to the memory.
Yeah.
We've only now understood. We don't know what comes downstream.
Yeah.
And I see points of light coming around it. Kessler's work, Lisa Feldman Barrett's description, Joe Dispenza's talking about the lower 3 energy sites, that part of your body becoming your mind.
Yeah.
So when you're traumatized and you're triggered into these emotional states, and he talks about very clearly, there's a piece on YouTube where he's describing the pineal gland. He talks about these 3 lower energy sites becoming the mind. When I heard that, and then we do what we do with the NLP technique on the trauma, that's not triggering these 3 low energy sites anymore. And the habit, we in our work, we task our clients every day, and we use a tasking form from another, I took it from another high producing coach, Marshall Goldsmith, who wrote the book Triggers. And we task them to reconnect to positivity all the time. And sometimes we actually task them to put them in the company of what triggered them before. And I can't tell you why it becomes a habit that fast, but I think the traumatizing memory, before we work with it when it's malleable, it is in non-scientific simplistic terms, it is amygdala referenced.
Yeah. Yes.
So you go in the library to find that trauma memory, you have to go to the amygdala section of the library. Once it's a normal memory, a happy memory, the memory of your first car or the first time you went skiing, to find that memory, you have to go to a different part of the library.
Yeah.
And I think and I can't tell you, that's not referenced, but this is the language that when I'm around PhDs that they talk about, is the memory no longer is tagged or referenced in the amygdala. It's tagged or referenced or indexed in the hippocampus. And that is instantaneous. It doesn't take time for that referencing to happen. It takes time, as long as it takes to go from short-term memory to long-term memory.
Okay.
1 sleep, 2 sleeps, whatever that focus is. It's not a habit. Now, whenever you have the memory and you go, wait, I just had that memory, it didn't bug me. Now we're in the rehearsal phase. And now we get into Lisa Feldman Barrett's work, where she says, now your brain is predicting you don't have to be all revved up anymore.
Yeah. So it kind of almost sounds like you're turning off a light switch, so to speak, or on whichever way you want to flip the switch. But what you're seeing maybe is once you kind of shift the energy around, for lack of a better word, energy around that memory, the trait starts to change almost immediately. So maybe what we're seeing is that the memory to trait connection, might be maybe a light switch is a too generalized, simple way to look at it, but maybe we're at least maybe a dimmer switch, as we're starting to dim it down as that memory gets reframed and, reprocessed in many ways in the brain.
If we took your light metaphor a little further, take a light bulb. So and I explained, to the listeners, I lost my first son. So take that memory now, I'm sad. So I put 9 volts through it. It's a 9-volt flashlight, put 9 volts through it. If I go to the plug and I take the 120 volts and put it into that light and turn it on, which is what traumatized memories do, I'm going to blow the light bulb right out the end.
Right.
It's going to be brilliantly bright until it explodes, and it ain't going to be very long. So I think what we're doing is we're lowering the energetic input into that. And of course, things that your amygdala lights up for you require energy.
Yeah.
And in fact, we know that it shuts down energy to other processes. That's why when we're in high stress, we start to get ill, because some of our core functions get sacrificed.
Right.
So, so this energetic shift, now that memory comes and it's not sucking down every unit of energy it can.
Wonderful. I know I got to get you out of here pretty soon. So let me ask you, I'll just throw you a nice softball right over the plate, because I know this is something you've got to be thinking about and talking to about. We are in the middle of a pandemic in both of our countries. Please lock us out. We are a disaster down here. Don't let us in. We are health risks. But what advice have you, because I'm sure this brings up a lot of things for a lot of folks. When people ask you from your area of expertise, how do I stay healthy, knowing that we have this, I'm careful with the word trauma, but there's a lot of stress right now in our communities as we're trying to open up. Many of us think way too quickly here. Yeah. That escalates the stress. We're beginning to have the fight response with each other, which is what we're famous for in the States. Do you have any advice from your expertise and perspective of when somebody asks you, hey, Alan, you're a smart guy. How do I keep myself sane in this time of insanity and pandemic? Any little snippets of advice you'd like to give our listeners before we end?
Well, first snippet is I go live at noon hour every Tuesday and Thursday with my wife. You can just click on the link on inspiredoutcomes.ca, join on Zoom or see us on Facebook, because we discuss this very issue twice a week at 12. In the NLP model of communications, I try and connect to other sources of intellect and intelligence around me. So we're bombarded with information, Matt, at a pace we can't keep, right? We can't manage it. 2 million plus bits per second. The literature, I understand, we can handle about 134 bits per second and 7 plus, the math. Yeah. So, but how do we get from the 2 million down to the 134? We do it with we have 3 primary filters, but the primary of those 3 is the delete filter. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if I'm in a negative mode, I delete everything happy from the world. Yeah. In the 2 million bits per second. So the first thing that I think you need to do is manage what filters are up. And we also say in our practice that our focus drives our behavior. Our behavior creates our results. Results are only feedback about what we're focused on. So if I'm focused on, boy, it sucks to be sequestered for the 7th week, then I'm invoking my negative filters. And my negative filters only let negative through. So the first thing I would suggest to people is they manage their filters to the best of their ability, If you can't manage them yourselves, reach out to you or reach out to me, and I'll help you manage I'll teach you some techniques to manage your filters. And that's the number one thing to do. Manage what you're letting in, because what you let in, that 134 bits per second, becomes your internal representation of the event. It's not the event. You've heard it said that the map is not the territory. It can't be. You're letting in such a small amount of information and you're making it your world. So you're making a map of the world that's just a representation of the world. It's not the world. And if you make a negative, sad representation, that is your map of the world. I'm joking right now that I'm on a COVID vacation. And my wife's saying, look, some people are suffering. I'm saying, but I'm not. I'm on a COVID vacation. I'm spending time in Stephen Covey's Quadrant 2. I'm doing podcasts with Matt. This is a blast. I don't want to be here forever, but man, I haven't been able to just think for a while. I've been on I've been the gerbil. Yeah. Just going around. I actually get this. I jokingly say every night is Friday night and every morning Sunday morning. You know, I hear Lionel Richie in my head every morning. That's traumatizing. But seriously, so that's the message, Matt.
Awesome.
That's the message. We're putting up a filter to deal with the 2 million bits per second. That's science. Be careful what filter you put up. Put up a happy filter. Let some happy through.
I think that's great advice for our listeners, especially as this thing wears on. And I think we're hitting another peak of that stress, at least here in the States. So great advice. Alan, we'll put detailed bio links on traumainformedlens.org so everybody can see that in the show notes. But if somebody's just listening to this, maybe a good website to learn more about the great work that you're doing.
Yeah. So if you Google inspiredoutcomes.ca or me, Alan, Allen, and then Kanerva, Kanerva, Inspired Outcomes will come up every time. And on our website, there's a trauma counseling page. And the research, there's a 40-year history of how we got to where we are today.
Awesome.
And all the research for those people who are deep divers into the detail, the N's, the P's, the R's, and that, fill your boots. It's all there. And then if you want anecdotal stories, Life After PTSD is a great place to hear people there's 80 or 90 episodes of people who've overcome trauma. And then I'll be standing up my own podcast here in the next couple of weeks. And I always have a client on to tell their story, because I think at the end of the day, Matt, it's about people. They're so courageous, right? They faced whatever it was that traumatized them and they got through it. Mm-hmm. Then, if they're on my show, they're somebody who's now cleared their trauma and overcome it. And now they're courageous at the third time to actually tell their story so others can benefit. That's a home run, 3 home runs in a row.
Absolutely. And I thank you for somebody who's gone through your own experience. Thank you for the work that you do, because this has been, I can't wait to dig into some of that research as well. So, Alan, thank you so much. Like I said, traumainformedlens.org. We'll pack those show notes with links and get that new podcast link out there too. I'm excited to hear your work. And so, Alan, open invitation, my friend, to come back on at any time. I think we probably have about 6 or 7 more hours in topics that we could dive into just from our pre-show discussion as well. So thank you. Keep Canada safe and healthy for us. And hopefully we can open that border soon and share that double IPA. So take care, my friends. Stay safe, stay healthy.